The wild boar is often held by a small dog. Ovid. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. For those who have been listening for several episodes, welcome. I hope you continue to enjoy. And if you're a newcomer, welcome to you as well. I hope you like this episode and will continue to listen and go back and listen to my backlog for prior episodes. Before we get into the meat of this week's episode, I did want to go ahead and talk about the automatic video creation for YouTube. I tested that feature last week, which is something RSS, who is the host I use for the podcast. They rolled that out a couple of weeks ago, and it was very convenient in the amount of time I actually had to put into getting the episode to load. Essentially, I just hit a button. It doesn't give you any feedback. It doesn't tell you that, yes, this has been accepted. It just eventually shows up on your YouTube feed shortly after you hit that button. So that was very convenient and easy to do. And I did like how it created a sound wave effect on the video, and how it created like kind of a custom image that integrated my logo for the YouTube video. But there were some issues I had with it. I did not like that it did not create like automatic subtitles. I know that with my accent and with just the things I'm talking about, that those are not always 100% accurate, but it is something that I do think can help some people, and they can, that way if they have to mute my episode, they can at least maybe follow along with some of what I'm saying, or of course if they're hearing impaired. Not that I think that my podcast would be the best resource for that affliction. But that being said, I also did not like how I could not choose when to upload it. I had to wait for the episode to be published on RSS before it would allow me to push it out on YouTube. So in the interest of kind of keeping the uploads in sync and at the same time, I'm going to continue what I've been doing prior. I'm sure that RSS is going to continue to work and kind of like perfect this feature. But for now, I'm not going to be utilizing it in the future. So we're going to kind of go back to the standard of what we've been doing prior. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the meat of this episode. We're going to continue with our overview of East Asia between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. Now, I mentioned all the modern southern Chinese provinces last time and went over them with the exception of Fujian. That was not meant to disrespect Fujian. It was done solely to make sure this week's episode wasn't going to be too short. Pad this week's, essentially. I also forgot to mention Macau, which is not a province. It's kind of one of those special administrative districts similar to Hong Kong. They didn't have quite the level of autonomy, though, and no one was living in Macau at the time frame we've been speaking about. At least there's no evidence of that, so we won't really talk about them again until much later. Back to Fujian. Now, Fujian's name comes from the combination of the province's two most important cities' names, Fujiao and Jiangzhou. Now, zhou is an older word that is used to designate a political entity. Now, I understand that this is a very broad term. It is, and it lends itself to a certain flexibility when applying it to whatever entity you're speaking about. It could be a city, and of course a city could become a county, a province, or a state without ever changing its name, or vice versa. So it has a lot of flexibility when you translate it into English. You'll see a place rendered as, again, state, province, prefecture, etc. Modern Chinese provincial names use the term / character sheng for their provinces. This word has more meanings and can mean to conserve or simplify. So just keep that in mind. The character fu means blessing, good fortune, etc. The character jian can be used in a couple of different ways. It can be used to mean build or construct, but it also can be used to mean organize or set up. It can also mean foundation. So the name can be read as something close to established fortune or the foundation of fortune. A good name for a province and a very apt one. Fujian is among the richest in China, despite it ranking, I think, 15th out of 23 provinces in population. Fuzhou still exists as a city and is the province's capital. However, Jianzhou is now referred to as Jian'ou and is a district inside the modern city of Nanping. So I did misspeak a couple of minutes ago. Jianzhou is basically got absorbed and reorganized into a different city, but when the province was founded, it was one of the two largest in the region. However, these cities are not anywhere close to existence, of course, during the period we're talking about. Like Yunnan, Fujian does not see a standout Neolithic tool or material culture like the Jingpian near the Pearl River Delta or Zhejiang Delta of Guangxi or in Guangdong. Though I think it is safe to assume that there were sizable numbers of peoples living throughout the region in smallish hunter-gatherer bands. Like Yunnan, it is a very mountainous region. There is even a saying that says Fujian is 8 parts mountain, 1 part water, 1 part farmland. And the source on that is a little sketchy, but it sounds good and appears all over the internet, but I could not find the origin for the quote. Now, obviously, farming doesn't exist yet, at least not in any large scale. There is no evidence of humans even starting the horticulture that typically presages agriculture in this area. But the water and mountains do, as well as the land that will eventually be used for farming. These all exist. So these mountains aren't barren wastes dotted by splotches of shrubs and grasses, like, say, further west in the Tibetan Plateau region. They were filled with woods and verdant valleys, teeming with game and wild plants. And the waters that made up the province were different from the waters of the Zhejiang or the major water systems up north. There is a decently sized river system that feeds into the primary waterway known as the Min River. But by the metric of China's other, larger rivers, it is small, not just in length, but in terms of number of tributaries and discharge as well. It's still a very useful river, though. The name comes from the Min Chinese. This is a linguistic classification of a Chinese language subfamily. And more on all that later. That's just a whole can of worms that we'll get into further down the line. Another water factor to take into account of this region are several islands just off the coast of this region. These islands will be vital hubs or stopping points in the next season for this region. They become focal points of sedentary living, trading, and migration of peoples in the interior and of peoples from what is now Taiwan. And as I've said before, and will reiterate again, I'll be covering the macro groups taking part in these migrations in an episode specifically for that purpose. It just works better as the sole subject of an episode. For now, though, we're going to just follow the coast north to what is now the modern province of Zhejiang. Now, this name literally means Zhe River. Now, I've attempted to trace the etymology of this, but it's kind of obscure. It doesn't help that the river is now called the Qiangtang after a king in a more historical period, but more on that again later. From what I can gather, the character for Zhe is theorized to be a phonosemantic creation, and this is a combination of two characters written as one, a character for water, shui, and a different character also pronounced Zhe but meaning fold. Now, for those of you that, like myself, don't know what a phonosemantic creation is, I suggest Googling. It might not help much. Linguistic theory can be hard for some people, like myself, to really pick up easily. But essentially, though, think of it as something like when you adopt one word from one language into another and hide or obscure its origin by using more familiar phonetics and your terms for the core concept, but doesn't quite have the same exact meaning. An example I found for this that is kind of easy to pick up on and is very appropriate given our area that we're studying right now is the English word hacker. In Chinese, this word is haike, and that's Heike is how you would spell it in English. But the characters that the Chinese use literally translate as dark visitor. So the maliciousness is easily conveyed by what they're talking about. But why they are malicious isn't quite clearly translated over. In the Chinese writing system, with its very large number of characters, meaning a number of different things, certain characters can be used to mean the same thing, lends itself to this type of interaction. But almost all languages, of course, have a few examples of this. I should point out, though, that this is not the same thing as a corruption, which is just when people are writing or repeating what they heard and, them not being 100% accurate. As an example for that, we have the English Yangtze River, which is just a corruption for Shang. We just heard it as Yangtze, and the Chinese, of course, just pronounce it Zhang. So it was just one of those things where we're not getting it 100% right when we're transcribing it. So the Zhe character in Zhejiang is used specifically for that river and for that province, and was probably adapted into Mandarin from a Yu hydronym, and we will talk about the Yu people later. But for our current time period, we of course have the myriad of unorganized hunter-gatherers to talk about. Most in the region would probably be living closer to the coast at this period of time. This is due to a number, of very smallish rivers that were feeding into the Qiangtang Zhe, creating, a number of very useful ectones. And as you might imagine, their diets would involve a lot of fish and waterfowl, in addition to, a large selection of wild foliage. And they would easily be able to obtain stones from the hills to the west and the south, either via long-term travel, seasonal travel, or from trade. with other groups. Some peoples in this region, though, are beginning to transition to a sedentary lifestyle. In what is now the village of, I'm going to butcher this like I've been butchering pretty much everything else, but Kuahuqiao, a Neolithic culture begins to form, and it has been given the name, the same name as the village. These people built stilted wooden houses over the area's marshes and used dugout canoes to traverse them. They also had pottery, which, as we know in East Asia, predates agriculture by a couple of thousand years. In addition to your standard stone tools, the larger ones, they've also begun to, of course, have those specialized Neolithic bladelets, polished stone, and the like. And they've also begun to use, more, decorative stone, things like jade for jewelry and ornaments. Though, of course, jade, I believe, can be fashioned into some manner of tools as well, though it's obviously not quite as good for certain tasks as others. And because of its its green hue, it's not used too much for practical effect. They also had domesticated dogs, and there is also evidence to suggest that they had either domesticated pigs or were in the middle of that process by, controlling boars to a certain extent. They didn't seem to have domesticated rice, but they were definitely using wild strains of it and other, foodstuffs that will eventually become domesticated. And we will dive into those with way more detail in our next domestication episodes. Now, this culture forms right at the end of our timeline of 6000 BC, and it will last in the area for around 1,000 years or so. So we can't say for sure when they got what, but as it pertains to our current season, based on what we know of other people in the region, what we can kind of guess in terms of how sedentary societies evolve, I would be willing to bet that when this culture, started as a sedentary society, they had, of course, your entire stone toolkit. They knew how to make pottery from, either being descended from the first pottery makers further north or interacting with them for, again, a couple of thousand years. And again, we know East Asians have been using pottery well before agriculture. There's plenty of archaeological evidence to suggest this. We can also guess that they had canoes. Humans have been using canoes for quite a long time. It was vital to, immigration or migrations all across parts of Southeast Asia and Australasia, as we'll talk about in our next little unit. So canoes, easily made, just burnt out logs, just kind of like hollowed out with hand axes and then burnt out, that kind of thing. These would have been something that people would have been using for a while, and it makes travel easier. They were probably using it to get across the rivers and through these little narrow marshes. Maybe they were making traps for fish or for small game, wood traps, things like that. And, of course, I think they probably had dogs. Dogs, of course, being domesticated for quite a while. And, not that far away in the grand scheme of things, further north in the Eurasian steppe. But there's plenty of time for that to come south. And, of course, dogs would be used not just for hunting and companionship. They would, of course, be used for food as well. But, like as we'll see in the future, further west, and then eventually here in the east and, of course, probably originally in Eurasia, dogs will eventually become excellent for helping humans manage other animals. And that's probably something, as you probably guessed from my quote, that these people were using their dogs for, to help manage wild or semi-wild or early domesticated versions of pigs. So I guess that would be my guess, that they had those four main technologies: Neolithic stone tools, canoes, pottery, and dogs. That's probably what they had when they started their civilization, or their sedentary society, and then they expanded out from there. But again, that's my guess. They may have had a better timeline, but unfortunately, finding sources in English about this culture is a little difficult. Now, this site was actually first discovered in the 1990s. And it was discovered by an archaeologist named Yan Wenming. And he has been the lead researcher on this site since its discovery. They have done a couple of expeditions. They had one in the 90s, and then they had one in the early 2000s. And I can't. It's hard to get 100% accurate English sources. There's a lot of Chinese sources about it, but they, at least from like the auto translate feature I've been using, it appears that they're all citing a lot of the same, quotes and evidence. But there are some excellent pictures you can find of the site and some of the artifacts they found. The canoes are fairly small, enough for maybe two people, and there's of course room. I guess you could probably maybe fit three in there if you had to, but my guess is that they'd want to use that for storage to an extent as well. Also, the houses, they have the floor plans. They are extremely small. They're essentially small squares. There is not much in terms of I guess extended living space. Not that they need to be. They probably just use that just to kind of sleep and a safety from river floods. Now, there are some other things that they'll find as well that are associated with this, though these I think is safe to say it's something you'll find a little bit later. And again, this culture will last until our next season. And why it falls apart is something we're going to discuss heavily the next time. Again, it lasts for about 1,000 years. There are probably more sites that could be associated with this culture. But again, they haven't been found, and we'll go into part of the reason for that in our next season when we talk about this kind of culture's collapse, for lack of a better term. But yeah, so that's what we have for Fujian and Zhejiang. Excuse me. So these are the two, I guess. Fujian, of course, is the last southern province. And then Zhejiang is actually kind of like one of those little weird border regions for kind of the future that we'll talk about. It is also not necessarily occupied by what we would consider the Chinese civilization until a later period, although much earlier than places further south. When we get back to our next main episode, though, we will be moving a little bit further north and moving finally into the Yangtze River, or as the Chinese call it, the Shangjiang. And we will be talking about the numerous civilizations that are proto-civilizations, maybe tool cultures, material cultures, whatever you want to call them, we'll be talking about those in the next couple of episodes. And there are quite a few to get through. There is one kind of in the mouth of the river, and then there's some kind of further upstream. And that's something that's kind of going to be occupying us for, the foreseeable future. Though I don't know if the Yangtze will take up quite as much as the Yellow River. But we're beginning to see that there are a number of peoples who are beginning to experiment with this sedentary lifestyle. And that number is only going to increase the further north we go. Why this happened more in the north is something we'll get into. There could also be the case, of course, that they just haven't found any evidence of these things in other provinces we've gone over in the past. But I'll talk about all that in detail when we get there. The Yangtze is home to a couple of cultures. The Yellow River is a home to it's kind of hard to say. There's some debate of certain groups should be associated with each other, but there's more sites further north than there are further south. And there's probably, and again, more reasons for that we'll get into. But yeah, I think this is probably a good place for now to call this episode. I know it's a little bit shorter. I've still got some things I have to do for work this week. And then I will be out of town next weekend for 4th of July stuff here in the U.S. But I will try to record kind of like a little bonus episode, one of our little fun ones again. And then I'll try to have that set to upload automatically on the 4th. And then it will basically, for you guys, it won't be any different. But I may have to work around it and not upload it until I return home on that Tuesday, which is the 4th of July. So it might be a day or two late. We'll see. It's kind of going to be difficult to say for sure with my work schedule being what it is. So I would like to thank you all for joining me this week. I hope you've enjoyed. Please, if you have any feedback or questions, let me know. If you have any tips on pronunciation, I always appreciate that. But yeah, you can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com, or you can direct message me on Twitter. You can also comment on any of my videos on YouTube. I will respond there. So thank you all for joining me this week. I hope you have a good week, and yeah, a good day as well. Thank you all. Goodbye.